say something to our kids, whether it's to clean up their room, do their homework or whatever. And you get the response, I hear. And you know that they didn't hear. But the truth is, that way too. How many times do we go through an experience and we hear, but do we really hear? Does it really penetrate? Does it really engage us? Often it doesn't. AT&T made a great effort to stop people from texting. Yeah, it can wait. Remember that phrase? It can wait. I still see it whenever, I haven't driven for a while going to New York. But driving to New York and you're on the highway, you can see a sign. It can wait. What can wait? Texting, right? Shouldn't text when you drive. Yet they found, after the tens of millions of dollars that they invested in this campaign, that people should not text and drive, it didn't seem to make a real impact. People were still texting. They found that there were still, many fatalities, accidents that resulted nonetheless, even though they had a great campaign to ensure that people shouldn't text. So it's like, telling your kids, go clean up the room. Yeah, I hear. Same thing as when it comes to texting. And that we can hear the message. We know that there can be a great negative consequence, but that doesn't mean it changes our behavior. It doesn't mean that it changes something about us, right? So the question is, how does a real change occur in our lives in a manner that we don't just merely hear? So if we go to the language of Yiddish, anybody familiar with Yiddish? Mm-hmm. No? Okay, we're going to get a little lesson in Yiddish. So German, or based on Old German. So zu hören is to hear. And there's another phrase, though, that is in Yiddish, and that is zu deheren. I don't even know how to translate that, but it doesn't mean simply just to hear, but it means to thoroughly hear, shall we say, or for the lack of a better term, to thoroughly hear. So what does that mean exactly, to thoroughly hear? And how is that thoroughly hearing going to make an impact in our lives? So let us, sharing with you. Oh, there we go. Okay. So Parsha Vaeschanan, when everything will click and no more in one year and out of the other year. So let us share the following story that is the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. Let me share a story. There was once a chassid who would pray at great length. He was an exceedingly simple fellow who in some places did not even know the basic meaning of the words of prayer. Still, he would pray at length. It was evident from his prayers that they were no mere lip service. He was really davening. He was really prayed. He prayed with all of his energy. The other Chassidim were amazed. They were amazed when they asked him, They asked him, how could you pray so intently if you didn't know the meaning of the words you were saying? So he answered, I only pray with what I heard from the Rebbe. That is a comment the Rebbe made on the words on the Shabbos liturgy of prayer. Remember and observe. It says about Shabbos, Zocher v'shomer. Remember and observe. We heard in one utterance in the commandment to remember and observe the day of Shabbos. In this, our Rebbe expounded, in your every utterance, remember and observe the one, meaning God. With this single idea that he heard from the Rebbe, he prayed for 40 years, day and night. We need to appreciate this, and to truly appreciate it, to fully depict it, as my father would say, that the inspiration of a single thought is all you need to pray for 40 years, day and night, Sunday, Monday, Shabbos, and holidays. This is Chassidus, not only to hear, but to deher. Not only to heren, but to deher. In other words, there was one teachings that affected him to such a degree that Shomer v'zocher b'dibur echad. We say that actually in the Friday night liturgy in the Lachadodi. Right? Shomer v'zocher, remember and observe. God uttered those two phrases with one word. And so it is an utterance of the one, meaning every utterance should be impacted with a sense of the oneness of God. And it was that one teachings. He was a simple chassid. He wasn't someone who understood the great complexities of Torah teachings. But this one teachings, Ater Dahert, he heard through and through, that it affected him to such a degree that he was able to pray with that one teachings that inspired him for 40 years of davening. In other words, you have a teachings which is a light, but that light needs what we call a keli, a vessel. And if it's not contained within the vessel appropriately, then it could be a wonderful teachings, but the teachings is insufficient. It needs the proper container, the individual who is going to be able to contain it in an appropriate way. So by metaphor, you can have a beautiful diamond, but if you put it in an ugly setting, what do you have? You can have the most finest whiskey, single malt, great l'chaim, but if you have it in a glass that is broken, it's all going to fall through. So this chassid didn't have a crack, an unblemished whiskey tumbler. He was able to take just one thought, contain it, hold on to it, and allow the light of that thought to truly affect his prayers. So, with that, let us go into this week's Parsha to understand, based on this idea, a very profound and meaningful teachings. Now, we know we're in the book of Deuteronomy, in the second Parsha of Dvarim, Vaeschanan, and Deuteronomy means a second teachings because here Moshe Rabbeinu, last 40 days of his life, is repeating many of things that occurred in the 40 years of his leadership in the desert, and repeating many of the things with new details, but it's so to speak, a repetition. So we have a repetition in this week's Parsha of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments that was given in Matan Torah in the book of Exodus, as it was there in historic, chronological order of events. And here we have a repetition. So it's not a repetition of the Ten Commandments that were given at Sinai, but it's Moshe Rabbeinu repeating them. And by the way, there are some nuance of differences between the way he repeats it and the way it was originally given. And of course, since it's part of Torah, there's an important thing to learn from it. But we're not going to go into those details. What we're going to go into is here in this week's Parsha. God spoke these words to the entire assembly at the mountain out of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the opaque darkness, with a great voice which did not cease. And he inscribed them on two stone tablets and gave them to me. Moshe is speaking in first person and recounting, speaking with the tablets that were given to him, but it was a great voice that did not cease. In Hebrew, lo yasaf. Now, that word, lo yasaf, you could understand it, that it didn't cease, meaning God didn't pause, he didn't take a breath. It was like a continuous voice of God that spoke. Or lo yasaf means that it was without a continuation. There was lo yasaf, it wasn't added to it. In other words, it's a one-time encounter that God spoke to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. So it's a little ambiguous what that term means. And the Medrash here has three different understandings of this term. So let us take a look at Medrash over here in the third text. It says, God spoke these words to the entire assembly with a great voice, which did not cease. So Rabbi Yochanan said, the one voice split into 7 voices, which then split into 70 languages. Rabbi Shimon ben Lekash said, every prophet throughout history had prophesied from this voice. And the rabbi said, which is the majority opinion, it did not have an echo. All right. So what does this mean exactly? What is this concept over here? So we have 3 different opinions. We're not going to go into the first 2 opinions at great length, but just basically the first 2 opinions saying that the Torah was one non-ceasing voice, meaning it didn't stop, it continued to the future. How? In 70 languages. That's one. Excuse me. Excuse me. That's one understanding. Another understanding, the second opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Lekash, is that the voice of God didn't cease. What does it mean it didn't cease? It continued through the prophets throughout the generations, that the voice of God continues through them, right? Reverberates throughout history in all the different languages and in all of the different prophets of Israel. The third explanation is what we're going to focus in on. And we need to understand, it says that there was no echo, which would seem to suggest that it was a weakened voice. Because if it's a powerful voice, seemingly there would be a powerful echo and it would reverberate throughout. And then I've asked this question himself in a sikha, that this third understanding that there isn't an echo is suggesting a weakness in the fact that there is that there was no echo, and especially if we're again speaking God's voice, it is a very powerful voice. What does this mean? And seemingly, this is actually tampering with the natural order of things, as we all know that when a powerful, loud voice, especially against the mountain, is going to produce a powerful echo. So it seems to be somewhat miraculous that the voice of God, there is no echo. And the most important thing is, what kind of lesson does this have for us in our lives, the fact that there is no echo to the word of God? So what I'd like to share with you is some of the interesting concepts of the relationship between the metaphysical and physical, between spiritual and physical, that the Talmud speaks about. It says about the Jerusalem Talmud. Let me share it over here. One moment. Okay, let's take a look over here. The Jerusalem Talmud tells us the staff of Rabbi Meir was in his hand, and it would impart to him knowledge. What is it telling us over here? That the physical reality of this staff was imparted with knowledge. We see further in the Talmud, tells us, lest one will say, who is there to testify against me? The very stones of this house and the beams testify against him, as it is written, for the stone shall cry out of the wall, and the beam out of the timber shall answer it. What are we saying over here? That the physical, whether it's in the staff or whether it's in the stones of the home, are imparted with an awareness, with a knowledge. In the latter case, in text number 6, of the sins of an individual. As sins of an individual are affect the physical reality of their home, so much so that they will, so to speak, testify against the individual. But this time we can understand Rabbeinu Bachya mentions a French custom that it became an accepted practice among the pious Jews of France to construct their caskets out of the wood of their tables to demonstrate that man does not take anything with him into the world to come, and that his efforts in this world bring him no merit, save for the charitable deeds he performed while alive, and the generosity he performed at his table, feeding and hosting those in need. This is also why the sages said, he who spends a long time over his meal will have his life extended. Why? His life is extended because he spends time at his meal, and the physical reality of that table is imbued with it, so much so that now you make a casket out of that wood because it's imbued with the merits of your lifetime. Can't take anything with you but your merits. And the physical casket that you make is imbued with the casket, in the casket. So Rabbeinu Bachya takes from this and explains, behold, our ears have heard and many have related to us that among the great personages in Spain, the notables and philanthropists, and most honorable and ancient custom has become widespread. When they go to their final resting place, the table at which they hosted and fed the poor is fashioned into a casket and board for burial. All this is to inspire and instill in the heart that even if man's peak reached the clouds and his wealth rose to match the wealth of King Solomon, the only thing he can take with him in all of the efforts in this world is the good he performed and the charity he compassionately gave to the poor. As Isaiah said, and your righteous shall go before you. And this bears to mind, I can remember very clearly upon hearing the news here in Montreal on Motzei Shabbos, Gimel Tammuz in 1994 of the passing of our dear Rebbe, and driving to New York with our kids, and being there in front of 770, very painful moment. And when the casket came out, it was made out of the Rebbe's table, which he davened by. The table that which he davened. That's what the casket, recognized it right away. the casket, and it is based on this idea that the physical inanimate object is inanimate, but yet is imbued with all of his prayers, all of his crying out to God for the sake of people in need and caring for others. Because what else can we take with us but those things that we did for others and the mitzvahs that we performed in this world? And this is the concept that the physical is imbued with the spiritual. Where does this all come from? Where did this all begin, this concept? It actually began in Mount Sinai. And this is the idea of the echo. An echo means that something bounces off the physical. What happened in Mount Sinai is the Word of God, which is infinite, is now being imbued in a finite world. So the natural course of things should be that it should bounce off, because the two are antithetical one to the other. A physical and the spiritual, the infinite with the finite. But that's not what happened in Mount Sinai. What happened in Mount Sinai was that the Ten Commandments, Anei Hashem Elokecha, God is communicating himself to the world, is now imbued within the world and becomes absorbed within the physical. This is what happened in Mount Sinai. Now, truth be said, this concept existed before, but only amongst the spiritual elite. Only someone like Moshe, like Avram Avinu and Yitzchak, Avram, Yitzchak and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, they were holy individuals. And being as holy individuals, their physical reality could be imbued with the spiritual. And even that had its limitations. What happened in Mount Sinai is now all of us have that capability. We all have the capacity to imbue our world with the infinite of God. Let's take a look at the reading over here. Text. The Rebbe says as follows: when God declared, Anechi, I am the Lord your God, it was with a great voice. Nothing was able to stop it, so that it saturated the entire world, even the inanimate realms. Everything became infused and permeated with the sound of Anechi. Therefore, by the rules of nature, the Ten Commandments could not have an echo. The reason it had no echo was not because God's voice was weak, but on the contrary, because it was such a powerful voice. For this reason, it did not carry on and did not have an echo. So, what are we saying over here? What we're saying is very simple. Prior to Matan Torah, prior to the giving of the Torah, the physical and the material worlds were two distinct lanes on the highway, and they couldn't really fuse entirely. Even those who were holy and spiritual and great righteous individuals, as are the patriarchs and matriarchs, nonetheless, there was a distinction between the material and the physical, even in their lives. They could not imbue a physical object with holiness. When we're talking about holiness, it doesn't mean that they can't have, there's a very important distinction over here. Could you have holy intent? Absolutely. But that's a spiritual endeavor. Your holy intent, your love and awe of God, that's of a spiritual notion. Here we're talking about is that the physical itself should be imbued with a sense of holiness. That was only something that happened in Matan Torah. In other words, it became imbued thoroughly infused integrally with the Word of God, with the infinite. That's what happened in Mount Torah. So what does that mean for me and you? The fact that Mount Torah had an absence of there was no echo. It was a perfect absorption of Anechi, of God himself within the material world, that now we can, engage in the material world and connect to God in the material world is one idea. But what does that mean for me? What do I have from this? Besides the fact that, of course, every mitzvah we do now with the material world is imbued, the tefillin, the mezuzah is imbued with a divine quality, which didn't happen before the giving of the Torah. That's one component, and that idea is a rich idea that we've learned many times in the past, and therefore we make a dwelling place for God in this low world. But let's understand and appreciate this on a personal human level. What does that mean that we're imbued with the message of God in such a way that it becomes completely absorbed in us, right? Again, every mitzvah is that way in the physical world, but let's take it on a personal level for ourselves. So what does it say, the unique thing about Avram Avinu? Avram Avinu. It says about him, because Avraham hearkened to my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my instructions. So it says, the word there in English is because, but for those who are familiar with the word in Hebrew, it says Ekev Asher Shama. So again, translation is because Avram had hearkened. But the word because over here usually would be ki or mipnei, but here it's Ekev. Ekev has a double meaning. It doesn't mean just because, but it also means heal. So why would the word heal be here in reference to Avram Avinu? So the Alter Rebbe explains. He says as follows: my great-grandfather, while still a child being educated by the Alter Rebbe, once asked him to translate the verse, because Avram hearkened to my voice. So the Alter Rebbe answered him. He answered that Tzemach Tzedek, his grandson, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, through the test of the binding of Isaac and through the other tests, Avram came to daher. Remember what was daher? Not merely to listen and to get it, but to thoroughly get it. God's command with every aspect of his being, from his head through his body, all the way down to his feet. Later, the Tzemach Tzedek elaborated on the interpretation of his grandfather that he just gave. And he said the following: our father Avraham, with the sacrifices he made in his work, publicizing godliness in the world, so refined himself, his character and his body, that even his heel would deher, meaning thoroughly be absorbed, the call of God to a far greater degree than even the head of a great intellectual. With his head, the intellectual might hear. With his heel, Avraham could deher. Again, what is deher? So heren, to hear, is to hear, to get it. But where do you get it? How do you get it? Where do you get something? You get it intellectually. But what's the problem when we get something intellectually? We're learning now. We're learning something intellectually. What's the problem, though? We have something called the neck. From up here to bring it through here. Sorry. From up here to understand something intellectually, and to bring it through the neck is the funnel that doesn't necessarily allow that which we know to affect us emotionally. And from emotionally, that it should then come to affect us behaviorally. It says that this world is created with the letter Hey. And one of the explanations is that the letter Hey expresses the uniqueness of this world. As we know, the letter Hey goes across and then down, and then there's a little left leg that's detached from the top. So we have thought comes down into speech, and then we have action. So you can talk the talk, walk the walk is a detached reality from what we think and what we say. That's the nature of this world. The letter Hey, it's created with showing many different explanations. This is one explanation, expressing the idea that the way we behave can be detached from that which we know and think intellectually, which in fact is. What was unique about Avram Avinu? Avram Avinu took that which was in the intellect, funneled through the neck, which then can now detach it from even one's feelings. And from there to bring it into one's all the way down to the heel. And even in things that might seem simple and removed and not very refined spiritual things, and that's what the heel is. It's the bottom that's pretty lifeless, especially if you walk ever barefoot in the summer, right? That he, the hair, was absorbed with godliness, with the message of God to the very heel of his being. So it wasn't just an intellectual endeavor, but it came down to the very heel of his being. That's what a deher means. So much so that he instinctually, because what's unique about our feet, when you live on autopilot, and all of us live somewhat on autopilot, right? Autopilot means that your feet naturally take you where you naturally want to go, right? So, your hands don't take you anywhere. They're expressive. They express your emotions, but they don't take you. Your feet take you, and usually they take you where, instinctually we go. So what's our instinct? Avram's instinct was that his feet, even to the very heel, brought him to godliness, brought him to connect to God. He was so saturated with the teachings that it affected every fiber of his being. That's what a deher means. So it's like, a little child, you need to teach them not to play with fire or with the oven, to, be careful with your hand, not to touch the burner, because you could harm yourself. At what point do we not have to teach that anymore? And why don't you have to teach it anymore? Because with every fiber of your being, you deher, you get it, you're absorbed with the reality that if you're going to touch this, you're going to burn yourself. And it'll be painful. You don't need, at that point, it's not an intellectual engagement. It's not something you need to, process. Process something is because you need to make it real for you, but it's so real for you that it's automatic, right? So that's what we're talking about over here in a deher, of that the spiritual and the physical is imbued in the physical, that there's such a deher, such an absorbed reality that Avram just naturally, instinctually connected to that. And this is what we're all ultimately capable of reaching. bring from the Frierdiker Rebbe again. So the Frierdiker Rebbe says, a Hasidic Jew knows well the meaning of the word deheren. We have discussed the differences between heren, to hear, and deheren at length in the past. By heren, I don't just mean the mechanical act of listening with one's hearing organs. Simply hearing with one's ears doesn't mean one has really heard. It might just go in one ear and out the other, as they say. So that's not even hearing, right? By heren, I'm referring to the sense it is used in the verse speak. For your servant hears, where the meaning of her or hear refers to understanding. It is the head that hears, that is, one hears with one's power of comprehension. As it says, the ear discerns words, which refers to understanding that which one has heard. But the heren is something else entirely. It is when the ear that hears conveys that insight, the deher, into every organ of the body. What's the practical difference between the two? So the Frierdiker Rebbe continues, the entire purpose of working oneself is that there should be a deher. There is a her, then there is what we call deher. To hear is also important, but it's only hearing. You can hear one thing and then hear another, even if one contradicts the other. The heron, however, is to engage with the thing so that it matters and leaves no room for anything else because he is so preoccupied with it. Therefore, the difference between hearing and the heron is that hearing bears no results while listening. He was engaged and did not hear anything else. But that is all practically, it is irrelevant. Practically all irrelevant. So let's take an example. We all know that we should love a fellow Jew, and we hear the message, and we get it intellectually, and sometimes it seeps into our heart, and we might feel and do a favor to another. But when we hear the fact that we should love another Jew as ourselves, that doesn't mean we don't hear another idea too. You know, that my life's important and other things are important. And as a result, we have competing ideas, which can exist when you hear. Because here, you hear one idea, but then you can hear another idea, and therefore they can be competing. But that's not Deheren. Deheren means that it resonates with us. It is in every fiber of our being. It is so real, the idea, that there is no other reality. When I was learning this, it came to me something that we have a backyard minyan. We have every Shabbos we daven in the Chabad house. But for the rest of the week, 3 times a day, daven in the backyard. And one of the individuals there came and said something was negative about another Jew. And I said to the person, I was, pained by it. And I said, it's 9 days. What are you speaking that way? The truth is, after learning this, I realized that it's not just the 9 days. Maybe that was my excuse, that maybe that the person might listen. And probably in my mind, I thought that this person wouldn't hear the message. How could you speak about another Jew this way? Forget about 9 days, 9 days, all the more so, but even if it's not the 9 days, if we really deher a love for another, then we can't speak negative about them. But we might feel a love for another, and sense and know and appreciate the love for another, but at the same time, we can also hear and entertain another idea about that person, which might not be flattering. Why? Because the love is not through and through. It's not to the heels. It might be in the head, might be even partially in my heart, but it's not through every fiber in my being, because then you could entertain the negative thought or say the negative thing. So I was thinking to myself, even for myself, in my response, that if I really felt the true Avos Yisrael, the true love for another Jew, then I was abhorred by speaking this person speaking negatively. But my first response, even though I had it in my head but I didn't say it, should be, Avos Yisrael, how could you speak this way? I think my Avos Yisrael needs to be more through and through. That I should not just be bothered by it, but it should bother me to such a degree that when I see the person, I say that's not possible for you to speak that way about another. Even if that person did something wrong. We all do wrong things. We all do things that need to be corrected. But I need to have that Avos Yisrael that should be just instinctual. That right away, Avos Yisrael. Why? Because through and through every fiber in our being, that should be how we connect with another. So we know we need to have Avos Yisrael. We know that we need to do mitzvahs. We know that we shouldn't text and drive. We hear the message, but not necessarily doesn't make it relevant to us that it becomes something real for us. The head is not just to hear, but it makes it so real for us, that reality of whatever it is, whether it is about godliness in a mitzvah, whether it's about another Jew, whether it's caring for another person, for their needs, for their things that they're going through. All of these things we usually process, and we need to, because hearing means you process, you let it sit in your head and then hopefully come to your heart, and hopefully then it changes your behavior. But ultimately, what our avodah is to truly allow it to penetrate to such a reality that we can't hear any other truth or any other reality, that there's not going to be a competing thought with that truth, because it is in every fiber of our being. How do we do that? How do we do that? It's, of course, through, as we're learning Torah, learning Torah, and especially Hasidus, allows the truth of God to penetrate our heads. At first, we can get it in our heads, the vision and the will of God and God's perspective, that we allow it to be entertained. We need to understand it intellectually, but that's not enough. There's one key word that is very contrary to the modern world. In Hebrew, it's called bittul. Bittul means self-abnegation. Bittul means it's not about me. That I'm able to put myself aside, and then what it is that I need to absorb could be fully absorbed and become a part of me. As long as the me of me is there, then the absorption of whatever I need to absorb that needs to be totally a part of me and not bounce off me like an echo, or to go in one ear and out the other ear, or even to come in. As the Frierdiker Rebbe said, hearing is not about in one ear out the other ear. It is that we get it, but it doesn't fully absorb in us because we're not ready to put ourselves aside, because I still want a little of me left there. And that little me of left there, it makes room for another reality, whether it's the love of another Jew, whether it's, the reality of God in my life. Yeah, there's God, but there's also me and my reality and what I want and what I'm looking for. And to be able to put that aside is a very difficult and challenging ordeal. And with that, we're going to conclude with this final beautiful story that we've told before many a time, but we're going to tell it again, as it's an amazing story from the Frierdiker Rebbe. There was a well-known story regarding a certain wealthy chassid was a fierce devotee of the Alter Rebbe and used to donate large sums of money to the Rebbe's causes to strengthen our holy land and release Jews from debtors' prisons. As a man of great means, Chassid had already married off his children, who were also doing well. He had undertaken to help marry off the children of his relatives by designating fine dowries for them, and he generally led a life of luxury. But in time, the wheel of fortune suddenly turned. He lost everything and became a pauper. While accruing massive debts, he set out to the Alter Rebbe and poured out his bitter heart before him. After hearing the man's plight, the Alter Rebbe raised his head and said in his trademark sing-song voice, "You speak of your needs, but what you are needed for, nothing?" Chassid felt faint and had to be taken out of the Rebbe's room by his assistant. Once he had returned to himself, he began to reflect on what the Rebbe had told him. He forgot about his own situation and then properly devoted himself to Torah and prayer. After some time, the Alter Rebbe instructed the Chassid to be called in. When the Chassid heard that he was being called to the Rebbe, he became very distraught, and he began to review over and over again the holy words of the Alter Rebbe had told him. "You speak of your needs, but of what you are needed for, nothing." He wept profusely, fasted, and worked on refining his character. By the time he went into the Rebbe, he felt as broken as a pot's hand. Hard. Okay, I don't know what that is. And the Alter Rebbe told him, "Now that you know and feel God's eternal truth, that God was, is, and will be all at once, that a soul clothed in a body can arrive at this truth, you can travel home, and may the one above grant you success." And that is what happened. With those 13 words that he spoke to him, the Alter Rebbe inspired and instilled within that chassid an essential light that fully permeated him. As Chassidim might put it, using an idiom that comes to us from the early Chassidim, so deeply did it permeate him that it singed his toenails. That is the heron. In other words, the Alter Rebbe said to him, you need to concentrate what you're needed for. He got that through and through. He didn't utter another word and was just focused on what he's needed for. And because of that it singed till his very toenails, that it affected him to the very core of his being. That was the real change. So this is, as Chassidim, what we want to try to achieve in our lives. And I must say that this is a huge challenge. How many things do I know the truth in my life? Honestly, I don't have to look at anybody. I look at myself. How many things I know that are the truth in my life? I know, I hear it, but do I dehead it? Does it really touch me that it's able to go through my very core and touch my very achiv, my very heel, that it be in every fiber of my being? That's ultimately what we want to achieve in our lives. That's what Chassidim are working on to achieve in their lives. It is a lifelong struggle, and we shouldn't be deterred because, again, I just look at myself and know that there are many things that I know a truth, but to what degree is it affecting me? The fact that we want it to affect us through and through, that we should be absorbed with this truth, with whatever truth it is, whether it's Ahavas Yisrael, whether it's God's presence in our lives, whether God's goodness in our lives, whether it's being thankful thoroughly, whether it's in our relationships to be able to really care. We all care. We all love another. We all have Ahavas Yisrael. We all care about doing mitzvahs. But what we want to be able to achieve is to the next level as Chassidim, that it should be instinctual, a part of my reality, that I don't have to even process it. I don't need to process it because it is so much me. So much me that I'm ready to give of me. I don't have to process that I should be giving. So much me that I love that Jew and that I want to, do anything that I can for them. Whether it's to put on tefillin with them, whether it's to teach them Torah, that it's so much through and through that I don't need to process it. It's a lifelong engagement. But that's what Chassidim are here for a long time. God's going to give us a long, good life so we can process and live this and ultimately come to this reality that it becomes so instinctual that it's me through and through. Any questions, folks? I unmute you. We don't see everybody's. Linda, thank you. All right, just looking to see any questions online. I don't see any questions over here. Clear?
No. Just want to thank you.
Pleasure.
Sharing.
I thank you all for joining. All right, folks. So we will continue our conversation for those who continue with us on Tanya tomorrow. All right. Have a good evening. A good Tvach, Shavua Tov. And we should transform these days from sorrow into great joy of the ultimate coming of Mashiach. And when Mashiach's coming, then it'll be a deher. That's what Mashiach means. Deheren. Now, godliness and goodness will be permeated so much in our being that there's no other reality. May it be now.
Amen.
Amen. Shavua Tov.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.